On a misty October morning in 1823, the people of Charleston County, South Carolina, awoke to a discovery that would haunt their community for generations. 7 enslaved individuals had mysteriously vanished overnight from the Ravencraft plantation, leaving behind only their broken shackles and a blood-stained document stamped with the seal of Colonel Thaddeus Ravencraft. What officials uncovered in that document revealed a network of betrayal, greed, and deliberate cruelty that reached into the highest ranks of Southern society. For nearly 200 years, the Ravencraft family poured vast sums of money into silencing the truth, but recently uncovered letters shed light on the chilling events that became known as the Wedding Gift Massacre. The reality behind Colonel Ravencraft's gift to his bride not only destroyed his own family but also shook the very foundations of regional power. Before diving deeper into the story of Colonel Thaddeus Ravencraft and his deadly marriage arrangement, make sure you're subscribed to our channel for more dark tales hidden in history, and share in the comments which city or state you're watching from. We love hearing from history enthusiasts who explore the shadows of America's past with us. The document left behind that night was later described by Charleston's mayor as the most damning evidence of human calculation he had ever seen. But to understand its true significance, we must trace the nightmare back to its roots. Charleston County in 1822 embodied everything the antebellum South aspired to be. Vast cotton fields spread across the land like rolling seas of green, their profits funding extravagant mansions and elaborate gatherings designed to rival Europe's aristocracy. Among the plantation elite, few figures commanded greater respect than Colonel Thaddeus Ravencraft. His military service during the War of 1812 earned him honor and generous government land grants. Ravencraft was a strategist by nature, towering over 6 feet tall, with sharp gray eyes and a carefully groomed beard. He carried an air of authority that demanded obedience, whether from soldiers in his command or the 200 enslaved people who worked his sprawling cotton fields. Those close to him described a man of rigid principles and unyielding ambition, traits that built his fortune and ultimately set the stage for his downfall. His estate spanned more than 3,000 acres of prime South Carolina soil, cultivated by enslaved families tied to the Ravencraft name for generations. Unlike many slaveholders who saw their human property as faceless labor, Ravencraft kept meticulous records of every person, their skills, their family ties, their health, and most disturbingly, their assigned market value, updated monthly in response to physical ability and trading conditions. His bride-to-be, Miss Cordelia Peton, came from one of Savannah's most distinguished families. At just 23, she carried the refined education of a Southern lady and an inheritance that would significantly expand the Ravencraft fortune. Their engagement, announced in spring of 1822, was celebrated as the perfect union of military honor and old plantation wealth. But behind the celebration, Cordelia harbored ambitions that went far beyond the role expected of a Southern wife. During their courtship, held through carefully supervised visits and strolls through Ravencraft's gardens, she displayed an unusual fascination with plantation management. Unlike most women of her rank, who focused on household duties and social engagements, Cordelia asked pointed questions about crop production, labor structures, and profit margins. Ravencraft, impressed by her sharp mind, began sharing information normally reserved for business partners and male associates. What he discovered was a woman whose intellect equaled her beauty, yet whose moral sense had been shaped by a childhood steeped in wealth, built directly on human misery. Her father, Horatio Peton, had amassed his fortune not only from cotton, but also from the trafficking of enslaved people across state lines. Cordelia grew up treating human lives as commodities to be priced, traded, and disposed of. Their wedding, scheduled for October 1822, was poised to be the grand event of the season. Invitations reached plantation families from Virginia to Louisiana, with preparations for a 3-day celebration. Ravencraft spared no expense ordering champagne from France, musicians from New Orleans, and even custom English china bearing the merged family crests of Ravencraft and Peton. But as the date drew near, Cordelia made a request that would ignite a chain of events destined to ruin everything her fiancé had built. During a private dinner in September, she asked for something no Southern bride had ever demanded as a wedding gift complete: ownership of 7 specific enslaved individuals. The discussion took place in Ravencraft's private study, a room lined with maps, portraits, and ledgers cataloging every detail of his empire. Outside, thunder echoed over the cotton fields as Cordelia calmly delivered her unusual request. "My dear Thaddeus," she began, her tone unsettling enough to make the colonel shift uneasily in his leather chair. "I have considered how I might best contribute to our prosperity after our marriage. I believe I can be of far more value than you might expect." She outlined her proposal with chilling precision. She wanted legal ownership of 7 people, a family consisting of parents, 3 grown children, and 2 young grandchildren, making her their sole master, independent of her husband's control. Her explanation was both practical and deeply personal. "These 7 form a perfect experimental group," she said, presenting a leather case filled with detailed notes about each one. The elder generation possessed blacksmithing and weaving skills. Among the younger were a woman gifted in herbal medicine, a man of extraordinary physical strength, and children young enough to be molded through new training methods she had studied. What Cordelia concealed was the true nature of these so-called experiments. Through contacts in Cuba and Brazil, she had learned of plantation techniques too brutal even for most of the antebellum South programs of psychological manipulation, controlled breeding, and punishment systems designed not just to break individuals, but to erase family bonds that resisted total submission. Ravencraft was caught in an extraordinary dilemma. Cordelia's request defied long-standing traditions of marriage roles and property rights at the core of Southern society. Wives might manage household slaves, but never field laborers, and certainly not as independent owners. Yet her proposal intrigued him. Cotton prices were unstable, and plantation owners were desperate for ways to cut costs and increase efficiency. If Cordelia's approach worked, it could be rolled out across the entire workforce, boosting profits in ways Ravencraft had only imagined. Over several late-night talks, they shaped what they named the Peton method, a complete system to control enslaved people, both physically and psychologically. The 7 chosen individuals would act as test cases, and their responses would determine whether Cordelia's techniques would be used plantation-wide after the wedding. The legal side was complicated and demanded secrecy far beyond the usual business dealings. Ravencraft brought in Marcus Bellwether, a Charleston attorney, known for keeping the darkest plantation arrangements hidden. Bellwether drafted papers, transferring full ownership of the 7 to Cordelia upon marriage, with clauses to keep the entire matter hidden from other landowners and authorities. Cordelia insisted on one chilling detail: the 7 would be moved to a remote corner of the plantation, cut off from the others, where her experiments could go on, unnoticed. A building disguised as a textile shop would serve as both their quarters and her private laboratory for applying these methods. By October, Ravencraft convinced himself that his bride's disturbing request wasn't cruelty, but innovative business thinking. He had built wealth by taking risks, and admired Cordelia's boldness. Their marriage would be more than love or status. It was a business alliance that could reshape plantation management in the South. What neither of them realized was that whispers of their secret deal had already begun to spread, setting in motion events that would twist their wedding day into something far darker. October 15th, 1822. Charleston County awoke to a crisp, perfect autumn day. The Ravencraft estate had been turned into a vision of luxury, white silk ribbons hanging from ancient oaks, long tables heavy with delicacies, and carriages arriving in a glittering procession that stretched for miles. Over 200 guests arrived, including the most powerful figures of the antebellum South. Governor Richardson attended, along with senators, judges, and wealthy planters whose fortunes could sway laws. The ceremony took place in the garden pavilion, with Cordelia glowing in imported French silk and Ravencraft sharp in his military dress uniform. Yet the real impact of the day came not during vows, but during the presentation of the groom's gift. Ravencraft had rehearsed this moment, knowing it would be remembered across the South. As the crowd fell silent, he raised his voice. "My dear friends," he began, "it is custom for a groom to give jewels or fine gowns, but my Cordelia has asked for something far more practical." The audience leaned in as he revealed the gift: legal ownership of 7 enslaved individuals, handpicked for their skills and potential, presented as material for innovative management techniques. He praised Cordelia's sharp mind and her plans to improve plantation efficiency, turning his wedding gift into what sounded like a business breakthrough. Guests applauded what seemed like progress, but in reality, those 7 were being torn from their families at that very moment, moved into isolation to begin Cordelia's experiment. The reactions were divided, but mostly approving. Several planters congratulated Ravencraft and even asked about trying similar projects with their wives. The idea of women stepping into plantation management was seen by some as a smart adaptation for the times. Yet, not everyone was impressed. Dr. Edmund Fitzgerald, the county physician who often treated enslaved people, was shaken by Ravencraft's cold, clinical tone. Reverend Samuel Hartwell also sensed something terribly wrong in treating human beings as test subjects for a wedding gift. Still, with champagne flowing and music filling the grounds, most guests brushed off Cordelia's unsettling remarks when she casually explained her plans breaking family bonds, reprogramming obedience, and reshaping minds as if she were discussing flower arrangements. The celebration lasted 3 full days, with endless feasts, dancing, and performances. But away from the laughter and music, in that remote building, Cordelia had already begun. The 7 enslaved individuals, 3 generations of the Kane family, were locked inside. Joshua and Rebecca, both in their 50s, had spent decades serving as blacksmith and seamstress. Their children, Samuel, 28, Mary, 26, and David, 24, were skilled workers, trusted on the plantation. Mary's 2 children, ages 6 and 9, made the family complete. Their strength came from their unity, their bond, and their resilience, which was precisely why Cordelia chose them. The barn-turned-experiment hall stood 2 miles from the mansion, hidden by pines. Once used for drying tobacco, it had been remade under Cordelia's orders. The walls were reinforced, windows barred high to block any view outside, and small rooms designed for forced isolation. At its center was the instruction room, outfitted with restraints and punishment devices more cruel than anything seen even on the harshest plantations. For the Kane family, this marked the start of something more sinister than ordinary brutality. They were now subjects of Cordelia's twisted vision. Cordelia believed that destroying family bonds would create more obedient workers, who cared only about their tasks, not about each other. She began with enforced separation, cutting off every line of support and communication within the Kane family. Each person was placed in a different room, only allowed to see one another during supervised labor. Even meals were staggered to prevent contact, and any attempt to speak resulted in punishment that struck not just the speaker, but also a randomly chosen family member. Her cruelty extended to planting lies. She would whisper to Joshua that his son Samuel had mocked his work, while telling Samuel that his father had requested harsher punishments for him. These false reports seeded suspicion and broke down the trust that had always kept the family strong. But Cordelia's most chilling tactic was something she called productivity bonding. Family members were forced into competitions, told that whoever performed best would be rewarded, while failure would bring punishment, not only for the one who fell short, but for their loved ones as well. Loyalty became a weapon turned against them, twisting their love into fear and guilt. The winter months suited her perfectly. With shorter days and longer nights, confinement was easier to maintain. She kept meticulous records, noting changes in behavior and tracking signs of breakdown with the same cold precision she once used to manage her father's household accounts. The conditions were harsh but carefully balanced, enough discomfort to weaken resistance, but not enough to risk death or visible injury. Food rations were measured to maintain life while leaving everyone perpetually hungry, a tool she used as both threat and reward. Sleep was deliberately sabotaged with thin mattresses, no blankets, and enforced postures that left them exhausted and more vulnerable to her manipulation. Every day she visited, accompanied by 2 trusted overseers who had pledged silence. She observed, questioned, and adjusted her techniques as if her subjects were pieces of an experiment, not human lives. Yet, in her obsession, she overlooked one critical truth. She wasn't breaking them. She was creating a family with nothing left to lose, united by pain and burning with the desire for vengeance. By February 1823, whispers spread across the quarters. The Kane family had been pillars of their community for decades, skilled, respected, and known for helping others in times of hardship. Their sudden disappearance, combined with strict orders forbidding anyone to ask about them, only fueled suspicion. Fear grew, but so did curiosity. Martha Washington, an elderly cook who had long been a quiet leader among the enslaved, began piecing the truth together. Working inside the mansion gave her access to overheard conversations, and her position of trust made her the center of questions and concerns. She soon gathered enough details to see that what was happening went beyond ordinary cruelty. The 2 overseers assigned to the remote building were notorious for their brutality and lived apart from the others, ensuring no divided loyalties. Deliveries of strange supplies raised even more alarms. Medical tools that seemed designed for torture, advanced restraints, and provisions suited for long-term confinement. Then there were the sounds. On cold winter nights, distant cries drifted through the woods, agonized screams that sometimes lasted for hours, followed by silences so heavy they were even more terrifying. In response, Martha began holding prayer circles, secret gatherings where enslaved people shared fears, offered comfort, and traded information. These meetings not only bound the community closer, but also became a way to preserve knowledge. Martha insisted that details be memorized by multiple people so the truth of the Kane family's suffering would survive, even if some were punished or sold. Over time, these circles evolved from quiet support into something far more dangerous. The first serious discussions of resistance, the realization that what had happened to the Kanes could happen to anyone, ignited a desperate courage that had never existed before on the plantation. Meanwhile, rumors were spreading outside the quarters too, though in very different ways. Nearby plantation owners had begun approaching Cordelia with interest, eager to learn about her so-called innovations. Talk of her progressive methods started to circulate among the elite, with speculation that her system might become the new model for labor control across the South. Under this growing attention, Cordelia pushed herself harder, determined to produce undeniable results. For her, the Kane family was no longer just a test group. They were living proof of an idea she hoped would transform the entire system of slavery in the antebellum South. Cordelia believed that the complete psychological collapse of the Kane family would prove her genius, turning them into model workers and securing her reputation as a visionary among the planter elite. Success would elevate her methods across the South, while failure could ruin both her ambitions and her standing. With spring planting season fast approaching, she saw this as the perfect test. 5 months of her methods would now be revealed through the Kanes' reintegration into the larger labor force. But what she expected as proof of obedience would soon be remembered for entirely different reasons. March of 1823 arrived, unusually warm, filling Charleston County with the sounds of preparation. Fields were readied, tools repaired, and supplies organized for the coming months of grueling labor that would determine the year's cotton yield. For Cordelia, this was the climax of her experiment. She was eager to showcase her subjects as living proof of her breakthroughs in psychological control. But instead of becoming docile workers, stripped of individuality, the Cains had undergone another transformation altogether. Their suffering had bound them together in a way Cordelia had never anticipated, forging a dangerous unity rooted in survival and the desire for vengeance. It began with David Cain, the youngest of the siblings. Cordelia had singled him out repeatedly, determined to crush his natural leadership and spirit. Yet her punishments and isolation had only sharpened his mind. In silence, David studied the building's weaknesses, the unlocked doors, the placement of tools, the paths of the overseers, even the way sound carried through the chambers. He memorized every detail, storing it all as ammunition for the day he knew would come. Even under strict isolation, he devised subtle ways to keep contact with his family, coded knocks, faint signals, and hidden gestures that slowly built into a secret network of communication. What Cordelia mistook for fractured bonds was, in truth, the formation of a carefully planned conspiracy with one goal: escape or revenge. The final spark came on March 15th. Cordelia announced a new test. Mary Cain's 6-year-old daughter, Sarah, would be permanently removed, sent to the main house to work where her mother could see her daily but never speak to her again. To Cordelia, this was the ultimate measure of her success, proof that maternal bonds had been broken in favor of labor efficiency. But when the overseers arrived that morning to take Sarah away, they did not find a compliant family. They walked into an ambush. David Cain stepped forward, not with the desperate courage of a broken man, but with the calm defiance of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. When one overseer raised his hand to strike him, the family moved as one. What followed was not chaos, but the execution of a precise plan. They had studied, coordinated, and waited. Within minutes, both overseers were dead, not killed in frenzy, but with deliberate precision. Using tools refashioned into weapons and techniques learned through observation. But that was only the beginning. Their months of endurance had not just been about surviving. They had been waiting for their true enemy, Cordelia herself. They knew her habits, her timing, and her patterns. And on this morning, they were ready. Cordelia Ravencraft set out for the building with her usual confidence. After breakfast with her husband, she gathered her notes and supplies, her mind fixed on the integration test she planned to conduct. The plantation bustled with spring activity, the voices of workers in the fields, and the rhythm of tools against soil carried through the air, filling her with certainty that her system would soon reshape plantation management across the South. She walked with the self-assurance of someone who had never faced resistance she could not crush through, planning in control. But what she found when she entered the building was nothing like the orderly experiment she expected. The overseers lay dead on the floor of the instruction room, their bodies displaying signs of precise, intentional killing. Around them, the evidence of months of preparation was unmistakable: tools remade into weapons, escape routes prepared, and supplies gathered. What had been designed as a chamber of obedience had been transformed into a fortress of resistance. And at the center of it all stood David Cain, not the broken man Cordelia imagined she had molded, but a figure hardened by suffering, his intelligence sharpened into a weapon, his will bent entirely toward survival and retribution. His family stood with him, not scattered like frightened captives, but arranged in the precise formation of people who had carefully prepared for this moment. "Mistress Cordelia," David said, his voice stripped of fear and submission, carrying a steadiness that months of torment were supposed to have broken. "We've been waiting for you. There's something we need to discuss." What followed was no ordinary exchange of words, but the structured unveiling of a case the Cain family had built over months of quiet study. They had memorized every detail of Cordelia's methods, her punishments, her notes, her designs. They knew her better than she imagined, and they presented not just accusations, but a complete record of her cruelty. Their aim was not simply to confront her, but to end the possibility of her program spreading across the South. They understood their suffering had been a trial run, designed to prove a system that could be inflicted on countless others. Escape alone was not enough. Her entire vision had to be destroyed. David Kane was no longer just a man in rebellion. He had become someone who understood the machine of slavery itself, its authorities, its punishments, and its politics. He had devised not only a plan for survival, but a strategy to ensure that what happened in those walls would reach beyond Charleston, beyond South Carolina, beyond Cordelia's circle of influence. Their actions that morning were not the reckless violence of desperation. They were the deliberate execution of justice by people sharpened into something unrecognizable by their months of torment. When Cordelia's body was found later that day, the manner of her death would be a story that authorities would work tirelessly to bury. But the Kanes' plan had never been about vengeance alone. They left behind carefully prepared records, documents, and evidence meant to reach those who could expose what had been done. Colonel Thaddeus Ravencraft discovered his wife's body around 2 p.m. after she failed to return from her daily inspection of the experimental facility. What he found would shatter not only his family's name, but the illusion that his wife's project had been a harmless curiosity. In the center of the instruction room, Cordelia lay dead, surrounded by a display that could only be described as a museum of cruelty. Every instrument, every device, every manipulation had been arranged and labeled with chilling clarity. Her own detailed notes and correspondence had been sorted and presented, forming an undeniable record of her plans to expand her methods across the region. Most damning of all was a carefully written account prepared over weeks, describing both the torment inflicted on the Kanes and Cordelia's plans to replicate her program with other enslaved families. The Kane family themselves had vanished without a trace, leaving behind not chaos, but order. They had taken nothing from the plantation, destroyed only what was necessary, and left a meticulous record of everything. It was a departure as deliberate as their resistance, designed to ensure that the truth could not be easily erased. Colonel Ravencraft's first instinct was not grief, but containment. Within hours, he had summoned trusted allies from the planter elite, warning them of the scandal that could destroy them all. By evening, prominent families from across South Carolina had gathered at the estate, confronting evidence so complete, so damning, that ordinary cover-up strategies would not suffice. Together they resolved to implement what they called comprehensive suppression. Local law enforcement, newspapers, and state officials were brought into a coordinated conspiracy. The official story would be simple. Cordelia Ravencraft was the victim of a sudden slave uprising. The culprits, it was claimed, were swiftly captured and executed. But no bodies were ever shown, and no executions ever took place. The remote building was dismantled and burned, the overseers recast as innocent victims, their roles in the experiment erased. Above all, the Kane family's written account had to be destroyed, though whispers suggested multiple copies existed, scattered beyond the reach of even the wealthiest family's influence. The cover-up was ruthless, but imperfect. In trying to erase the truth, the planter class only gave birth to whispers that spread faster than their lies. In quarters and camps, in abolitionist meetings, and across state lines, the story grew into a legend of a family who had turned suffering into strategy, and who had not only survived, but dismantled one of the South's most sinister experiments. Cordelia's death was hidden behind official lies, but the collapse of the Ravencraft legacy was irreversible. The plantation's name would never escape the shadow of what had happened there, no matter how tightly the truth was bound. In the months following the March 15th incident, Events began unraveling that would strip Colonel Thaddeus Ravencraft of his standing and turn his once celebrated family name into a mark of scandal and disgrace. The first cracks in the cover-up appeared in late April, when unsigned letters surfaced in the offices of Northern abolitionist newspapers. These messages contained precise accounts of Cordelia's experimental program, alongside information that only someone with deep knowledge of both the plantation's inner workings and the efforts to hide the truth could have known. The letters were crafted with skill, written in a way that gave them credibility even to skeptical readers. They described the plantation's layout, listed overseers by name, detailed the equipment used, and, most damning of all, quoted directly from Cordelia's correspondence with other planters who had shown interest in replicating her methods. The timing could not have been worse for the South. The abolitionist movement was surging in the North, and this evidence of organized torture provided exactly the kind of documentation reformers had been seeking. Within weeks, the Ravencraft plantation became a centerpiece in anti-slavery newspapers and speaking tours. But the deadliest blow came not from the abolitionists, but from within Southern society itself. Other planters tied to Cordelia's project now found themselves in danger, unable to answer questions without exposing their own involvement. They quickly began distancing themselves, canceling business deals, spreading rumors, and leaving Ravencraft to bear the full weight of the scandal alone. By summer of 1823, Ravencraft had been cast out of the networks that upheld planter society. Banks withdrew credit, longtime merchants demanded immediate repayment, and even neighboring estates discouraged contact with his enslaved workers, fearful that his plantation had become a breeding ground for dangerous ideas. His military rank, once a source of influence, became a liability, as politicians avoided any association that might taint them by connection. Invitations to social events stopped arriving, business partners cut ties, and old friends melted away. Meanwhile, within the plantation itself, unrest was spreading. Word of the Kane family's defiance had ignited hope, and enslaved communities across the region began to see the Ravencraft estate as a symbol of resistance. Martha Washington, the elderly cook who had led prayer circles through the winter, evolved into something much greater. She built a network that reached into other plantations and free black communities in Charleston, spreading knowledge about weaknesses in overseers, vulnerabilities in security, and ways to resist. What began as a way to honor the memory of the Kane family had grown into a movement of coordinated resistance, sending shivers through the planter class. By autumn 1823, the results were undeniable. Overseers vanished, equipment was sabotaged, crops were ruined with precision that spoke of careful planning rather than random violence. Authorities were stunned by the sophistication of the attacks. Clearly directed by someone who understood the mechanics of plantation operations from the inside, Ravencraft responded by hiring more overseers, fortifying buildings, and tightening control over the enslaved, but each step bled money he no longer had. By December, his estate resembled less a plantation than a garrison. Armed guards patrolled day and night, workers were locked away except during supervised labor, and fear hung in the air like a heavy fog. The cotton harvest failed, livestock was lost, and sabotage gnawed at every corner of his crumbling empire. The end came not in an explosion of violence, but in the quiet math of ruin. He could no longer pay for the very measures keeping his world intact, yet cutting them back would guarantee destruction. Trapped, bankrupt, and abandoned, Ravencraft made a choice that would finish his fall and expose everything he had tried to protect. On January 3, 1824, standing in the fading grandeur of his decaying mansion, he announced the truth, surrounded by furniture soon to be sold off to pay creditors. He confessed not only to his wife's experimental program, but also to his own role in hiding it. It was no act of conscience. Ravencraft understood his enemies already held enough evidence to destroy him. His confession was an attempt to seize control of the narrative, to salvage what he could and drag others down with him. What he revealed was staggering. Cordelia's project had never been an isolated experiment. It was the pilot for a system of torture and psychological control meant to spread across plantations in South Carolina, Georgia, an Alabama program designed to crush resistance at its root and turn human beings into broken instruments of profit. The confession laid out names, dates, and detailed accounts of other plantation owners who had funded, guided, and supported Cordelia's experiments. It exposed that the so-called innovative management methods celebrated at their wedding were actually the result of months of coordination among powerful Southern families. Each had planned to apply similar programs on their estates once Cordelia's techniques proved successful. Even more devastating, the confession revealed that local sheriffs, judges, and politicians had been informed about these experiments. They had agreed to shield the program from prosecution in exchange for access to its results. After Cordelia's death, the cover-up involved lies under oath, destroyed records, and threats against witnesses' corruption that reached the highest levels of state authority. But hidden in Ravencraft's testimony was something he had never meant to expose. It showed that the Kane family's escape had been far more advanced than anyone believed. Records uncovered during his investigation revealed the family didn't just flee, they connected with abolitionist networks, spreading intelligence on plantation weaknesses throughout the South. David Kane, the young man who led his family, displayed remarkable skill. He saw the vulnerabilities in the plantation system, built alliances across boundaries, and organized resistance like no enslaved person had before. He became a true threat to the very structure of slavery itself. His network gathered intelligence, supported escape routes, and even coordinated sabotage across state lines. Plantations that had nothing to do with the Ravencraft program began experiencing strange failures and setbacks that pointed to organized resistance. Authorities traced some of this back to northern cities, where former enslaved people were channeling information and resources into increasingly complex operations. The Kane family hadn't simply escaped, they had become part of a movement that systematically attacked the foundations of slavery. What terrified the Southern elite most wasn't rebellion, it was the realization that enslaved people were developing strategy, organization, and unity on a scale once thought impossible. The Ravencraft case proved that cruelty meant to break people could instead create leaders capable of dismantling the system itself. And then came the most shocking detail of all, Cordelia's own fate. Ravencraft's hidden documents showed that she hadn't died during the March 15th clash. She had been captured by the Kane family. They subjected her to the same psychological and physical torment she had inflicted on them, carefully reversing her methods against her. She spent her last hours enduring every cruelty she had once designed, delivered by those who knew her techniques better than anyone. Her death was neither quick nor merciful, was a deliberate lesson in suffering, one she could not escape. This story reminds us that some of the darkest horrors in America didn't come from the supernatural, but from deliberate human cruelty, born when people convinced themselves that certain lives were disposable. Do you believe the full truth was uncovered? Or do you think Charleston's archives still hide secrets about the Ravencraft case? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this tale, subscribe, hit the bell, and share with someone who loves dark history. Many more secrets remain hidden in the shadows of America's past, and we'll uncover them together. By February 1824, the Ravencraft plantation was abandoned. Its buildings rotted away as creditors fought over debts too large to repay. Thaddeus Ravencraft disappeared soon after his confession. Some claimed he fled to Mexico. Others whispered he ended his own life. But the legacy of the incident stretched far beyond one ruined family. Cordelia's brutal experiments and the Kane family's defiance became symbols that shaped both the abolitionist movement and the evolution of plantation practices in the North. Her methods provided undeniable proof of slavery's cruelty. Abolitionist groups circulated the Ravencraft Confession, using it to sway public opinion and win converts to the cause. And in the South, the Kane family's success became a source of hope, proof that resistance was possible, even under unimaginable oppression. David Kane's network survived the fall of the plantation, spreading knowledge and resources that fueled future escapes, acts of sabotage, and organized defiance. By the 1850s, plantation owners across the South faced repeated crises that hinted not at random misfortune, but at a coordinated campaign. The Ravencraft case proved something terrifying to the slaveholding class, that their cruelty had not produced obedience, but had instead forged opponents who understood their weaknesses better than anyone else. The abandoned plantation soon turned into a place of whispers and local legend. Travelers spoke of strange lights among the ruins, eerie sounds where the experimental buildings once stood, and ghostly figures wandering the old cotton fields. Yet its truest legacy was not supernatural, it was the revelation of what systematic cruelty, when exposed, could inspire. The surviving records, later called the Ravencraft Papers, offered rare insight into both the cold calculations of slaveholders and the brilliance of the resistance that rose against them. Today, only foundation stones and a polished historical marker remain at the site, offering a sanitized version of its past. But those who know the real story understand that 7 enslaved people endured systematic torture there, only to turn their suffering into the foundation of a network that helped weaken the very system designed to keep them bound. The story of Colonel Thaddeus Raven, Cordelia, and the Kane family reminds us that America's past is filled with hard truths. It shows us that the darkest horrors are not monsters or ghosts, but ordinary people who justify cruelty in the name of progress.